Have you ever taken a great high school history class? If you have, then you'd probably agree that the one thing that made it so enjoyable was your teacher. And understandably so. At their best, history teachers are vibrant storytellers, leading you on a gripping, fun, fantastic learning journey. But sadly, we know it can be pretty difficult to continue that journey after graduation, with no one there to be your entertaining tour guide through the world of dense, obscure historical research. Fortunately, 20-Minute History is here to help with that. It's the new podcast that aims to be your very own high school history teacher for everything you didn't learn in high school. Come join us as we explore commonly unknown histories in our informative, engaging, and amusing 20-minute episodes. It's 20-Minute History, out now on all your podcasting platforms.
That's Not Canon Productions podcast.
Hello everyone, and welcome to what's supposed to be an off week for Thugs and Miracles. As you've no doubt noticed recently, I've been working with That's Not Canon Productions and the podcast under their tent to showcase content you may enjoy when you're done listening here. So far I've had the chance to work with Smart Enough to Know Better and The Paranoid Strain, and this week I'm going to go even a step further by posting a recording of an interview I did with David A. Bradbury of 20-Minute History just a little while back. David's show, now between seasons 1 and 2, is a really enjoyable and very well-researched history podcast that I honestly can't recommend highly enough. We get into the topics and personalities he covers on his show, his approach to history, and quite a bit more, so rather than me describing that to you here, I'm going to just step aside and let you listen. I hope you enjoy, and when you're done, be sure to head over to 20-Minute History to catch part 2, where we switch roles and David asks me the questions. With that, enjoy this rabbit hole interview episode of Thugs and Miracles. Rabbit hole number 7. An interview with 20-Minute History. Today we're coming from, myself in England, yourself in California, Dave Bradbury of 20-Minute History. Obviously, listen to all your shows. I'm very excited to have you on here, but why don't you give us and the listeners a chance to go ahead and understand who you are, what you do, and where they can find your podcast.
Sure. So, hello, everyone over at the Thugs and Miracles audience. My name is David Bradbury. David A. Bradbury is the name that I use for my podcast. I am the host of 20-Minute History, and our goal is basically to highlight people, events, points in history that didn't get a fair shake when we gave them a first look. So in my first season, I highlighted a lot of people who were unknown or underrepresented in the historical discourse. I'm currently working on season 2, so that'll be coming out within a couple of months. I'm from California, as Benjamin sort of alluded to, and I'm happy to be here.
Well, sounds great. No, I know we are both with the TNC network, the That's Not Canon podcast network, and definitely excited to be a part of that. And so wanted to say thanks to Zane and all the people over there before we get going, because it's cross collaboration is, definitely part of being a part of that network. So thank you to all the people there. With that being said, I'm going to just jump into question number 1 that I have for you. And just because I'm not trying to be totally gimmicky, but I do like to have a little bit of a gimmick. Your 20-minute history. Right. And so, without trying to make this kind of one of those ongoing conversations that some of these podcasts get into that are a little bit too self-congratulatory in my mind, I'm going to put you on the clock for 20 minutes. And we're going to roll through these questions and we'll see how it turns out. So if you're ready, here we go.
Let's do it.
In your trailer, you talk about the romantic notion of great teachers and people who take a subject such as history and who deliver them with an almost, and can I dare say this in the age of COVID, a very infectious love of the topic. what are some of the elements, in your opinion, that make a great teacher? And how do you try to inject this into your shows at 20-Minute History?
Sure. So I think there are several factors going into play here, one of which you sort of alluded to yourself right here, which is an infectious love of the topic. I think that when we have teachers in our lives, one of the things that they have to have is a sort of passion for the topic that is, to borrow your word, infectious to the audience that they're trying to reach, because you can tell when someone doesn't love the topic that they're talking about in the classroom, on a podcast. It just doesn't fill you with the same exuberance as with someone who really, really does have that drive, have that passion for everything that they're talking about. I would say also that there is a necessary sort of rigorous dedication to the research that you're doing, because I don't mean to be too harsh on high school history teachers everywhere, but one of the conceits of 20-Minute History is that not only that there were certain things that were left out of your high school history class, but also that there were certain things that your high school history teacher might have gotten wrong. And that's not necessarily entirely their fault. You know, curriculums have a certain hand in influencing what the teacher says. But what I try to bring to 20-Minute History is a level of discourse that is slightly elevated. So bringing that sort of accessibility to the topic, but also making sure that it does cover the breadth of the dialogue, the historical dialogue surrounding the issue. And I think the last thing there is something that you try to highlight for Thugs and Miracles, which is storytelling. Especially in a short form podcast, if you're not telling a cohesive, intriguing story, then I think you're not doing half the work that you should be doing. So that's, I think, what I'm trying to capture in the romantic sort of trailer that I've put together.
No, I appreciate everything you just said, because it's you want to, at some level, it's not at some level, we're trying to be entertaining. This is an entertainment format. Nobody's coming to us for an actual degree, for a grade, for anything else. And so I agree with you that if it's not entertaining, then really why stay with it? And some people might be entertained by the very dry history teacher recitation of topics and facts. I don't think most people are that way. At least that's my opinion. And I think that's kind of where you're coming from. And so, no, I agree with everything you just said. I appreciate that, you do have some very fun bits inside of 20-Minute History. You have, your French and English accents are, just absolutely, over the top and great all at the same time.
Thank you. I was trained as an actor as well, so that's probably where that comes from. No, and to go back to your point about the coming to us for a degree, like nobody's coming to 20-Minute History hoping to get like a college lecture. And I would even go one step further, that if there is anybody that's coming to my podcast expecting that, don't put in me the same level of trust that you would put in a college professor just right off the bat. I would say that I always encourage people that listen to my podcast, like, look, I've done my research, I've fact checked everything, so you can trust me. But if you want to know more, if you want to, go even further, please, by all means, do your own reading, because I can't cover everything in 20 minutes. No,
we're the marijuana of history. We are the gateway drug to get the kids to go ahead and, So,
I love that.
Note,
love that.
Yeah, well, you feel free to use it.
Okay.
Throughout season 1, I noticed that, you have a couple of names. P.T. Barnum, you went ahead, you actually created an addendum episode to him because you had such a, I'll call it a fascination with Hugh Jackman and his portrayal of the great entertainer and some of the logical and historical fallacies that came along with that. So a lot of these people are really well known, but a lot of the people that you profile are much less popular. The three girl, her name is escaping me, that fell down the well, that kind of launched television.
Cat Fisk.
She that's obviously, I forgot her name, so I apologize for that. But yeah, but it shows how she had a tremendous impact on history, but she was that much less popular. She's certainly not P.T. Barnum. How do you come across personalities that you profile? And do you find that there's a common thread that's running between them, all the way from a Kathy Fiscus all the way to, the P.T. Barnums of the world?
So before I get into that question, I have to insert that fascination with Hugh Jackman's portrayal might not be the right word. I would sort of say visceral reaction, because if you listen, I will edit that. If you listen to anybody listening to this, if you listen to my addendum episode to the P.T. Barnum episode, which is all about the historical inaccuracies of The Greatest Showman, I do not hold back any punches for the movie. I find it rather grotesque. But disregarding that for a second, a lot of these characters are people that I have encountered in some way or another in my historical journey. Kathy Fiscus actually was a character that I received a guest lecture on. I did. So I got my BA in history from the University of California, Irvine. And that's in Southern California. And one of the guest lecturers for a Californian history class that I took with the wonderful Professor David Igler was a lecture on Kathy Fiscus and her legacy, her historical legacy throughout the years after she had died, from Professor William Deverell, which is one of the professors that I give heavy credit to in the outro to that episode. So a lot of these people are just people that I had encountered in one way or another throughout my studies. I think if I had to pinpoint a thread going through them, I think I would take us back to something which I believe I hinted at when I was giving my little introduction to this interview, which is all of these people in one way or another are not, for whatever reason, receiving a fair discussion around them in the popular discourse. Now, I don't want to say the historical discourse, because there are plenty of historians who are giving these people the discussion that they deserve, whether good or bad or somewhere in between. It just feels to me like a lot of them just are somewhat misunderstood for one reason or another, whether they're completely unknown or the story that we have of them in our imaginations is just so far removed from who they are as a person that I feel the obligation to jump in and give my own sort of interpretation, which I think is informed by the facts.
No, I can sympathize with you wholeheartedly in that, in one sense, in particular with Thugs and Miracles, where, at least most of the people, actually everybody you were looking at, I believe was, within the 19th century, the 20th century. You didn't go back further than, 200 years ago. So right. Yeah, it's when people are a little bit closer, you already see how much the facts are getting skewed, especially with somebody like that P.T. Barnum character, where, everybody has an agenda and wants to insert whatever they feel onto that. I mean, going back 2,000 years and you start talking about, all the religious and nationalistic concepts and everything else that's come out through history. Yeah, it's definitely difficult. So I would definitely appreciate that you're highlighting that, even with somebody who lived within, the 19th and 20th century, that how this stuff is all kind of tied together and how those issues are, how history does, I hate the saying history is written by the winners, because I don't think that's always the case, but I think that there's an intent behind that statement that is true, which is that people definitely skew the history to what they want it to be.
Right. It's a whole conversation. I mean, we could have a lengthy conversation here about historiography, the way that history is written. And in a certain sense, as you go 2,000 years back, as you have done for the Thugs and Miracles podcast, it gets even more complicated, because a lot of the contemporaneous historians that are writing about your Fredegundas, your Dagoberts, people like that, don't have a lot of interest in sort of documenting the facts as they do like telling a story for the common man. So and that's something that I'm sure we're going to touch on in our discussion. So I'll leave a little bit to that.
Yeah, because there will be a part 2 to this, or part 1, depending on how they listen to these 2 episodes. Yeah. So.
Yes. So you have to go check that out if you haven't already.
Sounds great. So that leads me to question number 3.
Okay.
So one of your season 1 episodes is Joseph Smith, and we just got done talking about the skewing of the historical record. And from your show notes, you literally wrote this saying most people's impressions of Joseph Smith depend heavily on whether they've read the Book of Mormon or whether they've seen the Book of Mormon. So this week we're attempting to take a more unbiased look at the man behind the faith. My question is, how do you attempt to be less biased when studying a polarizing figure, especially someone like Joseph Smith?
Well, less biased is definitely an accurate way to put it, because I don't intend to claim to be unbiased in a total sense. My interpretation is never going to be completely and totally removed from my own biases. But I think that the way that I generally approach these topics is just with the very basic principle that there are 2 sides to every story. And that is not to say that each side deserves, equal weight, because let me give an example. For Grigory Rasputin, season 1, episode 7, I think it was for me. It doesn't matter. But for Rasputin, I have to approach this from a sort of a less biased perspective, because a lot of people have heard, oh, this is a guy who has sort of mystical powers, who did all of these nefarious things to take down the Russian Tsar and implant himself as the Russian Tsar. And when it comes to the sort of mystical, spiritual aspect, I can't, in frankness, claim to believe for a moment that he possessed these sort of magic healing powers. Like that for me involves such a huge suspension of my disbelief that I can't pretend to give that equal weight to other possibilities which don't require that suspension of disbelief. But I can at the very least approach all of these topics from a perspective of like, well, this allegedly happened. Here are other interpretations that also are possible. Think for yourself, right? Allow the listener to think for themselves. And that applies to even people who are less controversial and have less sort of this spiritual aspect around them, like Leo Abse, who's my last subject, who has a rather scattered historical legacy depending on who you ask, and just approaching that from like, well, here's what some people think, here's what other people think. Find a middle ground. I think that's basically it.
No, I appreciate that, especially with Abse. Towards, in my research, I'm doing, the Brunhilde Fredegunda thing. I think in general, Brunhilde kind of gets better press over the years as far as being kind of the 2 queens. She was around a little bit longer, but ultimately her legacy was that while she did ultimately help build up, this dynasty, she also brought it down because she caused so much infighting, and people ultimately ended up, breaking down around her, and the whole thing kind of fell apart. Whereas like Abse kind of reminded me in a similar sense, obviously much further on, 15 centuries later, but, where he had gone from being the peasant, that was able to find his way to political power. And then towards the end of his life, it sounded like he died, having lost a lot of that kind of power that he had gained over the course of his years. And so it's, it is a complicated story. You can't go ahead and say like, oh, he just had this one trajectory.
Right. And that tackling these figures requires not just a recognition of that one trajectory that, say, you might get from like a very generic history textbook, but also acknowledging, as we've touched on earlier in the conversation, that history and the story that we tell is nothing without the people to interpret it, and that there is more than one way always of interpreting these scenarios, and that we need to consider all of them before we get a complete picture.
No. And I, honestly, a lot of times too, I think some of the times when they're trying to paint a good picture, they leave out a lot of the stuff that makes them human.
Right. Right.
And I appreciate, even in people I want to appreciate and I want to like, I still appreciate knowing that they weren't a saint. And even the saints you find out weren't really saintly. So,
well.
All right. Well, hey, this comes to, actually one of my last questions for you.
Okay.
Because Thugs and Miracle is a French history show. And also because we're taping this interview in February, which is still Black History Month.
Right.
I'd like to ask you in particular about Bessie Coleman. I find her stories insane to me.
Right.
And I say that because, I mean, like, if I went to, you said you worked as an actor. If I went to a movie producer in Hollywood and I said, hey, I'm going to go ahead and tell you the story of an African-American, Native American woman working on the south side of Chicago as a beautician who decides that she's going to scrape up some money and learn French in her off time to go fly over to France, or actually, I'm sorry, correction, to go ahead and boat over to France to go learn how to become a pilot. They'd be like, well, go away. Like, I mean, I have no movie producer. Maybe they'd be nicer for them, but honestly, it's an unbelievable story if it had not happened. So can you tell us a little bit more about, in particular, your time in France? Because, again, French history show, but also what are some of the things about her life that maybe didn't meet the time constraints of your show that maybe hit the cutting room floor, for lack of a better word?
Well, her time in France is something that is rather overlooked, I would say, in my episode about her, and that is unfortunate, I think, because in my episode I have so much to talk about with respect to her impact on the state of racial politics in America during the time that she lived, because she did have quite a disproportionate impact for just being a pilot and not being a politician or anyone of any sort of political power. So in the episode, I just sort of throw on a terrible French accent and just proceed to tell you, yes, she was in France twice, and she learned to fly, because I sort of have to move past that and get to the rest of the story. The interesting thing I think about her time in France is not just that she, as you said, scraped up a bunch of money and learned French in her off time, but also that she did go to France to learn basic flying skills from the top Parisian flight school. And then she went home and tried to make a living off of flying at home, quickly realizing, though, that the basic skills that she had learned, and granted, these are basic skills which we very much would not consider basic skills today. Bessie Coleman growing up in the sort of barnstormer era of aviation, where basic skills included like stalling the engine and going into free fall and doing loop-de-loops and all of the stunt flying that most commercial aviation pilots would only do in their worst nightmares.
Exactly.
But she quickly realized that as a Black woman, stop me if this sounds pertinent to today's times, as a Black woman, she was not able to make a living based on the skills that she and a bunch of other white pilots were already making a living off of. She realized that she needed to stand out more than a lot of white male pilots at the time in order to make that living. And so she actually ended up traveling back to France and doing actually a tour around European flight schools of just learning these insane tactics that then she would go back to America and make a living out of. Before I sort of end the tale there, I should also mention to you that it's funny that you started the question by talking about if you had come to a Hollywood movie producer and pitched this story. Well, Bessie Coleman actually did. There was almost a story. Yes, there was almost a movie surrounding Bessie Coleman's life. Bessie Coleman herself was almost an actress. She was actually in either late 1922 or early 1923. She was offered a spot in a movie which was not autobiographical. She didn't end up interacting with the producers of the film all too well, and so she ended up dropping out of the project, and then contacting Hollywood a little bit later in her career and saying, hey, what could we do to make this into a movie? I think this would be awesome. I'll help produce. And then the producer's basically writing back and going, so are you going to pay for it or what? And it just stalled out there, unfortunately, but still would have been a great movie. I would have loved to have watched it if it ever
where
come
was
to fruition.
where was Netflix back then? It would have been
I know.
they would have had 3 seasons out of it at least.
Oh my gosh, they would have milked the absolute bejesus out of that story.
Honestly, it's one of those stories, as I go through and I find a lot of these types of stories over the course of time, I do find them being turned into stories that are getting put onto Netflix. And
Right.
Off the top of my head, one guy I listened to I really like a lot, Written in Blood History did Arminius. And there's a whole show about the barbarian, which is all about Arminius. Like, it's literally, I keep on seeing names now popping up, as I learn more and more. And it's very fun to me to know that in history that there's just, again, this is a story you couldn't produce. You couldn't make it up. It had to have actually happened for you to even consider that it's reality.
Right.
And so, I mean, and why wouldn't it be? Why wouldn't she go ahead and go to Hollywood? She already went to France to become a stunt pilot. So of course,
Right, exactly. I mean, she's already touring around the country. She's already got, thousands of people showing up to her shows. Why wouldn't she, go to Hollywood? I also should add here, because I think it's rather admirable with respect to that. Bessie Coleman, I don't think I had time in the episode to touch on how much she did for the advancement of the Black community in America. I can't remember now that I'm sitting here whether or not it actually got a passing mention or a detailed analysis in my episode, but she was wont to put on shows, and if she learned that the audience was either going to be completely segregated, or even worse, that Black people and people of color were not going to be allowed into the venue at all, keeping in mind that this was the 1920s, she would threaten to cancel the show. And she would actually walk up to the venue staff and put her foot down and say, you either let Black people sit next to white people in the same exact venue and you watch me fly, or I don't fly. I'm the entire, and why wouldn't she? She's the entire show. If she doesn't fly, well, then they've got jack squat, right? It often goes overlooked because of her colorful history as a pilot.
No, it's a force of character that comes into play
Right.
at that point. Whereas, I mean, honestly, the reason I could see her not doing it is for the same reason a lot of people avoid just confrontation. And
Right.
I can only imagine, like you said, 1920s,
Right.
Jim Crow era, the whole 9 yards. I mean, the heart of the
Right.
Jim Crow era, doing that and saying that, it's there's a level of inner strength with someone like that is absolutely just can't make it up.
Right. Heart of the Jim Crow era and right after the Tulsa massacre.
Yeah.
So we're talking about the height of racial tension in pre-World War II or like, 20th century, early 20th century America, essentially. So,
Well,
yeah.
I think it's a great, it's a very positive place to step off is, with this, the internal strength of Bessie Coleman.
Yeah.
So just one final question for you. Where do you see your show going in season 2? Do you already have a list of names and topics drawn up? And when are you hoping to have that available to us?
So season 2 is going to be a little bit different. I did reveal the topic of the season in my latest bonus episode that I've released. But it's not going to be little biographies this time. The season topic is actually going to be theses, theories, and conspiracies. That's the actual title of the season: theses, theories, and conspiracies. And what I'm sort of thinking of doing is taking some of the newest and most underappreciated historical theories and giving them the light of day. We're talking about things like the Williams thesis, as well as respect to new theories regarding things like the bombing of Hiroshima, which is a rather grim topic, which I'll actually be starting my season off with. So you can look forward to that.
That's
I suppose. Yeah. Well, the entire season is well, it's I don't want to say it's dark, but it's certainly at times not as uplifting and inspirational as many of the biographies found themselves to be. As for a time frame for release, the short and honest answer is I don't know. I'm currently working on the first episode, and research is taking quite a while. This is a one-man operation, so I don't have a lot of space to just sort of pass tasks on to people. Everything has to be rigorously completed. I'm hoping by June. So give me a few more months of research. I should have it out to everyone to start release, and again, on a weekly basis.
No, that sounds great. I mean, I fully get where you're coming from as far as trying to do all this stuff yourself. It's very, very difficult to try to go ahead and capture everything you want to do and do it right and do it also by yourself. So if you ever need any help with research, I would love to be able to, especially if there's any place where we can kind of cross paths, certainly feel free to reach out to myself. But with that being said, I also, one thing I do look forward to when it comes to June is even something like the bombing of Hiroshima. You took the story of Kathy Fiscus in particular, which at its heart, really, I was shocked when you went ahead at the end. I didn't know how the story ended. I never heard of her.
Right.
So I was waiting the whole time for you to be like, oh, they dug the side tunnel and they went in there, and the little girl was, a little bit worse for the wear, but, was otherwise. When you said she had died, I was just, I was almost shocked as I was driving along in my car listening to the episode. And, but you still went ahead and found a way to find the high points of that. The fact that, all the researchers were able to go ahead and, get funded for that. And there was, some good things that really did come out of it besides CNN. But 24-hour news coverage. But no, I fully understand that if there's one person I can think of that's going to take, something as difficult to talk about as Hiroshima and turn it into something very educational and probably with, at least a ray of a silver lining somewhere in there, it's going to be yourself.
Oh.
So,
well, thank you very much. I appreciate that.
You're very welcome. So I hate to break this to you. We blatantly broke the 20-minute barrier. We missed. So I guess everybody's just going to have to live with the fact that there's 7 or 8 minutes of extra, free baseball for.
It was an aspirational goal, and I guess you could say we shot for the moon and landed amongst the stars.
There we go. On that note, David A. Bradbury of 20-Minute History, thank you very much for coming on Thugs and Miracles. I very much appreciate you taking your time, especially with the time change between the UK and California. Wonderful conversation, and I look forward to season 2 coming out when you finally get it published. Thank you very much.
Thanks for having me, Benjamin.
All right. Thanks again to David A. Bradbury of 20-Minute History. As I said earlier, be sure to check out his show, as well as all the others on offer from That's Not Canon Productions. There's a part 2 to this interview episode on David's feed, along with all of his very binge-worthy Season 1, so don't miss out. Beyond that, as always, the music used for this show comes from Josh Woodward and includes his songs Bully and Lafayette. For a free download of these songs or hundreds of other great tracks, check out his site at joshwoodward.com. Notes on this episode, an updated monarchy tree, our Instagram feed, and a list of other great history podcasts are all available online at thugsandmiracles.com. Please visit and sign up for the mailing list so we can keep you up to date with announcements on new episodes and our monthly newsletter. Speaking of email, you can write to us at thugsandmiracles@gmail.com. You can hit us on Twitter at thugsandmiracle with no S on the end, or you can leave a comment on Facebook and Instagram at Thugs and Miracles. We look forward to reading what you have to say and getting your opinions on the show, the Merovingians, and anything else that's on your mind. We appreciate everything you have to say, and as always, we appreciate you. Okay, once again, my name is Benjamin Bernier. We look forward to seeing you next week when we get into the second part of our Coup d'etat series and the continuing saga of Clovis II and Sigibert III in our next full-length, regular episode of Thugs and Miracles.